Joining me to discuss all the day's developments related to the standoff in the Crimean region is Erik Brattberg. He's a resident fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. Welcome to the broadcast. We reported earlier about this UN envoy and these armed forces, and a kind of a tense standoff there. He was interviewed afterwards, and I thought what he had to say was rather amazing, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. He's talked about diplomatic efforts, and he said Ukraine could be pulled apart if the rhetoric increases instead of decreases. All of these players have a role to play. How do you diffuse things from a point? Because it's easy to throw salvos at one another, isn't it?
I think that's right, Mike. And I think what this incident illustrates is how tense the situation right now is on the ground. And I think that's why it is so important that we have both a combination of diplomatic efforts, but also you put pressure on Putin to make him more willing to engage in a diplomatic process.
And you and I had a chance to talk briefly. You think it's a sprinkling of one more than the other, then?
Well, I think you do need to have both. I do think the real solution to this crisis must be a diplomatic one. There are diplomatic efforts underway. Earlier today, Secretary Kerry met with his Russian counterpart, which really was the first face-to-face meeting between Russia and the U.S. since this crisis started. I think the fact that Russia and the U.S. are not talking to each other is a good sign. However, there does not appear to be any willingness on the side of Russia to move troops back and to accept international monitors on the ground. So I do think you need to apply some pressure to move them in that direction.
And when you say pressure, what are the options on the table?
Well, I think specifically, I think you need to consider sanctions, including things like asset freezes and visa restrictions on key Russian leaders right now. The U.S. is contemplating sanctions. The EU leaders are meeting tomorrow to decide on sanctions. I do think that is the way to go forward, and I think it's very important that the U.S. and the EU together pursue that approach.
And that is the tricky part, isn't it? Because as Nathan said, the messages from Europe are rather nuanced. Some rely more on Russia than others. So how do you get everybody to come with a combined effort?
Yeah, I think that's right, Mike. And I think the U.S. State Department and the White House are making a lot of phone calls to Europe tonight to really push the Europeans in that direction. There's been reluctance from some member states, Germany, for example, and the UK, to really adopt a sanctions approach. But I do think in order to put enough pressure on Putin to make him more willing to negotiate, I do think you need the EU and the US together to move towards sanctions.
And the UN envoy that we talked about earlier did say that there is this other side of the equation that isn't really reported on very much in the West, which is there are people in the Crimean region who really are concerned, who speak Russian, who do kind of feel like, in fact, we heard from one of them saying that they're fearful of a genocide. This really is another part of the story, and perhaps one of the reasons why Russia has such a vested interest.
Well, I do think, there's a lot of things coming from both sides, both Russia and the U.S., two very different stories, and there does not appear to be any overlap so far in the rhetoric coming from the U.S. and Russia. That was very apparent during Secretary Kerry's meeting with his Russian counterpart earlier today, that the two sides view the situation very differently. And I think in order, to reach a diplomatic solution, I do think they need to come together.
What are you going to be looking for over the next few days? What are some of the telltale signs that we should be watching to see that things perhaps are coming down, or maybe that they are on the increase?
Well, I do think we need to watch both the U.S. and the EU considering sanctions, but I also think we need to look closely on the ground, what is taking place. Will the Russians pull their troops back to the bases in Crimea, and will Putin allow international monitors on the ground? I think those are the things we need to concentrate on right now.
Erik Brattberg, thank you so much for your analysis. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. Good to be here.